Jesus said, "Labour not for the food which perishes, but for the food that leads to everlasting life, which the Son of Man gives to you." Throughout the Gospels, we've got this trail of breadcrumbs, right, that leads us to the main meal of who Jesus is, the bread of life. I was just looking earlier this morning, and there's 76 times the word for bread is mentioned in the Gospels. 20 in Matthew, 20 in Mark, 20 in John, 16 in Luke. But it's funny because 77 is like a complete number, right? And Jesus is that last one that completes. So I just wanted to point that out. And so throughout the Gospels, you've got this trail of bread that leads up right through to the resurrection, but it sort of culminates around the Last Supper and Jesus' passion there and what he does for us. But the first time we hear of it mentioned is in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And the blood's pretty obvious. We know what that is. It's atonement. The blood is our atonement. It cleanses us from all of our sin. But the bread, it's not quite as straightforward. It is, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. And so as the disciples are on this journey with Jesus, early on in the journey, when he first commissions them as apostles and sends them out, and they go off 2 by 2 with nothing, and they come back. And it's right about that time when Jesus finds out that John the Baptist is also been beheaded. And then he goes into a quiet place, but he can't get away, so the multitudes follow him. And then he, with compassion, teaches them. And then they're hungry. The disciples say, "Hey, can send them off so that they can go find food." And he says, "You feed them." And long story short, Jesus does it, in case you didn't know. Feeds 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Later that night, Jesus goes up in the mountain to pray. The disciples are on the lake. They've been rowing all night, and they're quite worn out, I can imagine, about 3-4 o'clock in the morning, when they see a ghost walking on the water towards them, and they freak out. But then they hear a voice saying, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And Peter says, "If it's really you, call me out on the water." And so Jesus calls him out on the water. He sinks after he walks. And then immediately they're at land, and then Jesus teaches about the bread of life later that same day. But there's a verse in Mark 6:52, right? Mark 6:52. There's a verse in Mark 6, which is verse 52, which says, "For they did not consider the miracle of the loaves, because their heart was hardened." But what does the miracle of the bread have anything to do with this storm that they're facing and that they're going through on the water? What's that got anything to do with it? Well, what's that? What do we take away from that as well? And it's like, it's because Jesus wants them to realise that he is the bread of life, and he is the provision for everything that they need, for all of their needs. That the miracle of the loaves is transferable onto their need right now in the storm. Because they did not consider the miracle of the loaves, their heart was hardened, and they were helpless in the middle of this storm. You can just imagine their heads would have been absolutely spinning out of control. Right, this bread that's come from nowhere, like the teachings of Jesus on their own are hard to take in. So what do we do with that, right? I know with myself, I'm fortunate to have a lot of letters after my name. Most of them end with D for disorder, right? And But my problem is, right, Jesus said these signs shall follow them that believe. And so if a miracle that I'm looking for isn't happening, in the past the church has blamed the people that they've prayed for and their lack of faith. But it says that I do believe, and I think the thing that I've had trouble with is the fact that I do believe, right, because I'm saved, right? I know who Jesus is, I believe. But I have not until recently believed that he still heals, right? Because my common, which is actually common, my reasoned myself out of belief. Right? I allowed myself to rest on my experience. And my experience said that Jesus didn't heal. He did, but he doesn't do it today. And by resting in a stagnant pool of unbelief, I put God in a box of what I think he can and can't do, or worse, what he's willing and not willing to do. And this, what Jesus is saying is this, and that's why I think it's not as obvious as that, because right, in Psalms, right, what happened to the disciples? They forgot his benefits. They forgot what he was capable and what he was willing to do. Right, because Psalms 103 says, in verse 2, bless the Lord, O my soul, and I'll read on, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquities. Now, we don't have much trouble with that. But the next line says, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from destruction. And I don't know exactly where it was. I heard this just recently. I think it might have been a Bethel Sermon of the Week. Sozo, saved, healed, delivered. Right, that's what this is. Psalm 103, saved, forgives all our iniquities, healed, heals all our diseases, delivered, redeems your life from destruction. And the disciples were unable at that point in time to make that transfer from the miracle of the loaves to the provision that they needed in the middle of the storm. And if I can have my disciple come. And so, just have a seat. And so when Jesus is at the Last Supper, right, and he sits down with the bread, which would have looked something like this, I assume, right? Unleavened cake. It was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And he took the bread and he lifted up his eyes and said, Father, thank you that you have shown such great love to mankind, that you have provided for everything they need. And so symbolic, he took the bread and he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples. And he said, this is my body which is broken for you. Because his body was broken for us. And if you want to partake with me now, with the bread. We thank you, Father. And he took the cup. And he said, this is my blood which is poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And he passed it to his disciples. Wonders are still what you do. Mountains are still being moved. Thanks, mate. And it's not enough for us to rest in our current situation. It's not enough for us. And I guess there's things in my body that aren't what they're supposed to be. And there's a tension that exists within me about this because I know that it's not where I'm supposed to be. But while I allow myself to think that this is all right or that's the will of God, then I'm not going to press in. I'm not going to go forward. It's not labouring for the meat. There's no labouring. This is what I believe partly it represents, labouring for the meat that endures. Right? Because it's not always, sometimes it is, it's not always as simple as it happening straight away. Sometimes we keep going, regardless of what our current reality says about our situation. We must not let our current reality trump the Word of God. And so I'd like to invite anyone this morning who would like healing for prayer, or prayer for healing, my apologies, for anything in their body, to, as we sing this next song, to come forward and we'll just pray for you briefly.